Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Welcome to Liberty Law Talk. Today I'm talking with George Will about his new book, The Conservative Sensibility. George Will hardly needs an introduction. He is the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post. He is one of our great commentators on politics and culture in America. He's also a wonderful writer on baseball. He's the author of 15 books, including one of my favorite books, Statecraft, Soulcraft, and also a book on baseball of several books he's written on that sport, Men at Work. It's an honor for me to have George Will on the program because he was, in many respects, an introduction to me on how to write and think about politics as a conservative, going back to my time as an undergraduate student. So, George Will, welcome to the program.
Glad to be with you.
Thinking about the book, The Conservative Sensibility, what is the conservative sensibility?
By sensibility, I mean more than an attitude, but less than an agenda.
Okay.
It's a way of seeing and experiencing and, in a way, welcoming uncertainty, the dynamism of a market contractual society, the necessarily open future that characterizes an open society. To borrow a phrase from the late, great Karl Popper in his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. It is a way, as I say, of seeing and experiencing the world that is not disconcerted by the fact that things are out of control. The Virginia Postrel, who I'm sure you probably know, is a wonderful Washington writer, once said that the basic message of the Bible is God created man and woman and lost control of events. And I kind of like that.
Now the book is rich, and I hope we can explore all the different subjects and things you write about. I also saw in your book interesting paradoxes. So right away, one question I have for you, say the conservative sensibility, yet I think you are also rooting conservatism in America, or what it means to be an American conservatism, as conserving chiefly the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence and the natural rights. So that to me means not just a sensibility, maybe something else, doctrine, enlightenment, rationality, equality, things like this, more of a rationalist understanding of conservatism. How do you tease that out, or am I overreading you?
No, you're not. You're reading it perfectly. In fact, to preserve the American founding, the natural rights doctrine, which is that rights precede government, they're not dispensations from government, and the government exists, in the most important word in that second paragraph of the Declaration, to secure our rights, which is an inherently limiting function for government. It hasn't worked out to actually limit it, but it limits it in theory.
So the book, as we were discussing, you've got, you say one of the essential tasks for American conservatives today is to reconnect Americans to their natural rights heritage, to the Declaration of Independence, this important opening of the document. And yet this idea of sensibility, which would suggest something, I think, less than a doctrinal approach to being a conservative. And so I'm just curious about how we manage those two things.
It is less than doctrinal. I'm more interested in suggesting how we think rather than what to think.
Okay.
To begin with the Declaration, as I do and as America did, it's important to remember that Woodrow Wilson, who was the first president to criticize the American founding, told people, do not read the first two paragraphs of the Declaration. He said, they'll only mislead you. It's 4th of July rhetoric. Because as a good progressive, he understood that they had to overturn the doctrine of natural rights to fully emancipate government in the way that the progressives wanted. When Wilson criticized the founding, he didn't do it at the periphery. He did it root and branch. He said the constitutional architecture bequeathed by James Madison is fundamentally flawed, particularly the separation of powers, because that would inhibit a fully emancipated executive, and particularly a president who Wilson thought should look rather like Woodrow Wilson. When Wilson wrote Science Was in the Air,
Okay.
Marconi, Ford, Edison, the Wright brothers, literally in the air. And he thought that it was time to apply science to society, just as the hard sciences did. And he was, remember, taught at Johns Hopkins by some people who had gone, as Americans wanting advanced degrees tended to do in the second half of the 19th century, gone to Germany to study. And they'd come back full of enthusiasm for Bismarck's state and for the kind of watery Hegelianism that justified the government as a uniquely disinterested entity, not as a faction, but as uniquely, I won't say altruistic, but disinterested in organizing society.
Rooted in expertise.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The progressive agenda then as now is to concentrate more and more power in Washington, more and more Washington power in the presidency, and in agencies responsive to him and non-responsive to a society, to a Congress that is increasingly deferential to the executive branch. In this sense, the progressives have simply won. And my book is an attempt to launch the counterattack.
Now and that's something I want to discuss. And maybe one way to lead into that, I was thinking about your argument for conservatism trying to reconnect Americans to their natural rights, heritage. How do you see, or have you thought about, how did Americans of the early republic believe and hold to natural rights? How do you think they would have found their way to them and to accept them? Because I think that's an interesting way maybe to think about how we've lost them.
Well, when the first seeds of disaffection were sown between the colonists and the government in Westminster and London, Americans thought of themselves as aggrieved British citizens who were not being accorded their traditional British rights. By the time it came round to the Declaration of Independence, the dynamism of resistance and of violence and civil unrest had turned them away from that and said, no, in fact, we are Americans, and the rights we have, we did not bring from London. We found them in the wilderness, this vast American continent, thinly settled. And for that reason, we are asserting that we have rights that have a universal appeal. When the founders said these truths are self-evident, they meant evident to all minds, not unclouded by superstition. They did not say that everyone acknowledged these rights. They did not say that every society was mature enough to be organized around these rights. They did say that as an aspirational matter, the natural rights doctrine was a universal creed for mankind.
That we hold to. I think that's crucially what you're saying. So
precisely.
Yeah, but we hold to. So it's interesting thinking about, you say, and we've been talking about, the crucial challenge is a natural rights versus progressivism. Do you see progressivism as in any way endogenous to the American tradition, or do you see it more as something that was imported and is alien to the American constitutional tradition?
It was somewhat imported, as I indicated, from Germany, from European philosophy, but it is not in any way a natural descendant from the conversation in America that began with the founders. Indeed, Woodrow Wilson said with remarkable forthrightness that we are trying to overthrow what the founders did because it was the natural rights doctrine is a mistake, there never having been a state of nature as a sociological or anthropological fact. Not that the founders were foolish enough to think it was what philosophers call a heuristic device to help with reasoning. But what Wilson did say was the natural rights doctrine, which gives rise to limited government, was just fine when there were 4 million of us spread along thinly settled fringe of the North American continent, 80% of Americans living within 20 miles of Atlantic tidewater. But, he said, now that we're a giant society, welded together on a continental scale by steel rails and copper wires. Now we need a more nimble government, one of his telling phrases, a nimble government that is strong and quick-moving without the impediments of the separation of powers. So from the overthrow of natural rights, you get directly to the emancipated modern presidency and the disequilibrium, the overthrow of the Madisonian equilibrium between the branches of government.
So thinking about the interesting intellectual movements happening at the time, which you discuss in the book, I mean, does modern science, this is a question of mine, does modern science in the way it reflects on, talks about, proposes to manipulate nature, make it impossible for us to rationally believe in natural rights or hold to natural rights?
I don't think so. By natural rights, when you read the chapter in my book called Conservatism Without Theism, natural rights need not be grounded in, and I really don't think the founders seriously did ground it in, a theology, a belief in a divine creator and an endower of our rights. Rather, natural rights is broadly construed a result of rule utilitarianism. It says this: as a rule, in order for creatures of our nature to flourish, there are certain foundational rights that are indispensable to the flourishing. These are learned from experience, from history, that is, and also from disputation, from philosophic argument. And history and philosophy converge to produce over time what those natural rights are. Is this a settled doctrine? No. But it does mean that Americans are consigned, I think blessed, with a future of permanent argument about these things. Yeah. If you don't like arguing, you pick the wrong country, because we are a disputatious people, condemned to be such by, among other things, the natural rights doctrine, which is forever unsettled.
Yeah, so thinking about, it's a crucial element of natural rights is self-governing or self-government and the ability to consent to the laws that will govern you. You talk it a lot in this book, and it's a subject on the lines of a lot of conservative thinkers, the decline of the United States Congress in the 20th century, now becoming almost anemic in the body that refuses to govern, even though it has the most constitutional tools to do so. Talk about why, how Congress fits into this, which Congress did largely give away its powers to the creation of the administrative state you alluded to earlier.
Madison's one great mistake, and he can't be blamed for it. He could hardly have anticipated the emergence of the modern state or the modern world. But Madison said in one of the Federalist Papers that it is the tendency in a popular government for all power to be sucked into the impetuous vortex of the legislature. Exactly the reverse has happened over the last 80 years. Congress has been spinning off powers eagerly. People all talk about presidents usurping the powers of Congress. They've done no such thing. They've simply seized happily powers that Congress is all too ready to get rid of. What Congress does is increasingly it legislates in the name of laws what Christum Youth calls velities. We should have good education, a clean environment, and then they throw it over to the executive branch and say, you fellas fill in the details. And while you're doing so, you make the difficult choices and trade-offs so that we can be on the record as opposing something good and not on the record dealing with the costs of our good intentions. So this, as I say, I don't blame the presidents. I very much blame Congress. You know, the conservatives for a very long time were defenders of congressional supremacy. They said Congress is Article 1 of the Constitution for a reason. The president's fundamental job, which is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, is derivative. That is, he exists to execute what others have enacted. Conservatives realized that under Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, who came to Washington to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Woodrow Wilson, and then under Lyndon Johnson, the only president to have spent his entire adult life in Washington, and who did so, came first to serve in the New Deal. Under these four presidents, Congress became marginalized, and the government grew. And so there was a healthy conservative suspicion of executive power. Then, however, beginning January 20th at noon, 1981, conservatives had the heady experience of Ronald Reagan, and they somewhat fell in love with executive power. And for that reason, there's neither party today is a sufficient defender of congressional supremacy. However, there are signs that President Trump, wielding powers that all presidents enjoy because Congress has given them power over trade, is imposing tariffs, which means raising taxes unilaterally, and Republicans are beginning to have an epiphany, delayed and muted at the moment, but still welcome, saying that in fact things have simply gone too far in emancipating presidents from the Madisonian place that presidents should occupy.
Thinking about this issue specifically, Publius, as you know, talks about ambition, ambition being part of the statesman's calling, practice, and also ambition being tied to the institution you serve in. Why do you think Congress has not had ambition in itself and in its own powers? And I've been willing to do this because I think that's, as people really, Chris DeMuth and others think about this, it's how do you put that back in Congress when they really seem to like being talking heads or media figures, or that seems to be the way you actually use Congress, as Yuval Levin has discussed. It's actually like the platform for you to stand on to further your own career rather than for something for you to serve and be a part of. Yes,
precisely. In the second of the two greatest Federalist papers, first being 10, and Federalist 51, Madison says that we see throughout the American system the process of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. He assumed, the founders assumed, that the occupants of these institutions would have institutional pride and institutional identity and institutional self-interestedness. Of course, what the founders did not anticipate and did not want, but which immediately exploded on the scene in the 1790s, was the party system. And as it has grown, and as presidents have through perhaps modern means of technologies of communication particularly, we have seen that increasingly the members of the president's party in Congress think of themselves as team players, as spear carriers in the presidential chorus, if you will. Their job is to make life easier for the president and to do his bidding. This is a complete short-circuiting of what Madison anticipated would keep the equilibrium between the branches of government and protect liberty.
Yes. The thing too, certain senators and congressmen have referred to life in the U.S. Congress as being terribly droll and boring, and being without purpose. It's sort of, one wonders when they come back and connect all of these things, that if you emasculate your institution and give away all of its powers, and precisely what is there for you to do. I hope others will make that connection. You refer to Teddy Roosevelt as Hegel on horseback. How so?
Well, Teddy Roosevelt felt that leaving aside his sense of sort of racial identity,
yes,
and Northern European chauvinism, if you will, Teddy Roosevelt felt that the United States, spanning by the time he came around a continent, two great oceans, bringing out his naval interests, Teddy Roosevelt felt that the United States was destined for greatness, and that only an executive completely unbounded by constitutional restraints could do this. Hence, he pioneered what he called the stewardship theory of the presidency, which was that presidents are empowered to do anything they want unless they are explicitly forbidden to do it. Well, he used this power exuberantly, but without it without the kind of theory backing it up that Woodrow Wilson supplied. His great name, of course, Teddy Roosevelt came to despise Woodrow Wilson, but Teddy Roosevelt really began the growth of the presidency that Woodrow Wilson gave a theoretical underpinning to.
So thinking along those lines, it seems to be there's a notion, there's a notion here that I think we really do dispute, and that is someone like the Teddy Roosevelt or an executive and his bureaucrats and planners, actually, the belief being that they could bring us to some state of perfection apart from politics inside the government. Because no one really believes that anymore. No one really believes that planning, centralization, standardization through the government can make life better, can lead to a better republic. And yet, we're sort of in this, stasis or situation where no one seems to be able to move the ball forward in a direction you and I would like, or even the progressives is just sort of more and more government with no way of thinking about paying for it. How do you see that? Do you see things that way, or?
I think you're a bit too optimistic. I think there are progressives on the wilder shores of progressivism who really do believe that once you deny natural rights, your next step is deny human nature. And once you define human beings simply as creatures that acquire the culture they find themselves in, you endow government with enormous jurisdiction. Government then becomes the shaper of the culture, and through shaping the culture, the shaping of human beings. Now, we had a lot of nasty experiences in the 20th century. New Soviet man, new Aryan man, new this, new that. But once you say that human nature itself is not a given, then what is given is to government an enormous project to remake our consciousness. This is what's going on campuses right now. People are saying that people arrive on campuses as completely unformed, and it is our job as good progressive institutions to mold new people. So I think the vaulting ambitions that got us in so much agony in the 20th century have been domesticated somewhat, but hardly put away.
Thinking so interesting along those lines too. And this is a part of your book, is the need of progressive intellectuals, particularly in the U.S. campus, to remove Americans from having a sensibility or an affection for their founding, for their country, by this sort of continual pouring on of scorn of the founders. Something that I have direct experience of is here at Liberty Fund, we do a lot of conferences with high school teachers. My job used to be to put together the reading list for those conferences, and times I would observe the conferences. And the first 20 or 30 minutes virtually of every conference, you had to actually disabuse the notion that we shouldn't take the founders seriously because they were sexist, racist, and slave owners. And you had to actually explain to them, offer an apologia for why you would consider their ideas seriously. That always took me an example of how we're in such bad shape.
Well, you're right. Your first job was to combat what has been well called presentism. That is the belief that everyone who has lived prior to us was definitionally not as advanced and magnificent as we are, or as magnificent as we would have been in their context, which is the preposterous thing. When you start out by saying you just have to decide that Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson and Lincoln and all the rest were scoundrels, morally obtuse at best, then you have your agenda is set to wipe clean the slate and start America over again. Yeah. You may be quite sure when they do, they're not going to begin with the two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence.
It's interesting. I was thinking just practical lines along the point you make in the book, the denial of human nature. If you believe there is no nature, then you're also much more likely to believe in, say, modern monetary theory of the Sanders campaign, or what seemed to be undergirding Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal.
That's very astute of you. I hadn't thought of that. But in fact, if you deny human nature, if you deny a certain fixity, that is a restraint on action. Along comes modern monetary theory and says the same thing. It said what has bothered human beings through life is scarcity. An hour spent on this cannot be spent on that. A dollar spent on A cannot be spent on B. Therefore, we will conjure up modern monetary theory that says there simply is no scarcity of financial resources. That's the magical thinking brought to its reductio ad absurdum.
Yes. Now, another significant part of your book is you call it the judicial supervision of democracy. Now, here's another paradox I see in the book. On the one level, we have a Congress that has chosen to emasculate itself via the administrative state. But you argue one way to put back our republic is through a more firmer judicial line, enforcing natural rights in any number of instances. Yet a common conservative critique is part of the emasculation of Congress has come through judicial activism, particularly on the Warren and Burger courts. So maybe tell us what you're seeing and how you think this should work.
I think conservatives have been bewitched by their careless language, understandably recoiling against some of the more freewheeling decisions of the Warren court. Conservatives adopted the progressive vocabulary of early in the century of Oliver Wendell Holmes and others, saying it is incumbent upon, it is part of the morality of a majoritarian society that courts should be very deferential to majoritarian institutions such as Congress. Hence the so-called counter-majoritarian difficulty of judicial review. First, as a matter of fact, almost nothing that the federal government does is responsive to a majority in any meaningful sense. It is responsive to compact, intense, affluent, articulate, confident, and well-lawyered factions, and should be understood that way, that much of what the government does not come with the momentum of dignity imparted by true majoritarian support. Second, the question is whether America is about a condition, liberty, or a process, majority rule. I side with the first. It is about the condition of liberty. I grew up in central Illinois, marinated in the spirit of Abraham Lincoln. Grew up in Champaign County. It was, according to local lore, it was in the Champaign County red sandstone courthouse that Abraham Lincoln, traveling then around the circuits as a very prosperous railroad lawyer, first heard about the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It was in Lincoln's recoil against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and against the idea of popular sovereignty in the territory, that people should be allowed to vote slavery up or vote it down. It was a matter of indifference as long as majority rule prevailed. It was in his canny, implacable, subtle resistance to this that Lincoln's career, the greatest in the history of world politics, in my judgment, was born. So, if we're not about majority rule, if we're about liberty, then you see why I anoint in my book John Marshall as the third most important American in public life, after only Lincoln and Washington, because he understood that if you have a written constitution, you must have the judicial review to lay side by side the constitutional mandates and the desires of Congress and be ready to say that some of the latter are incompatible with the former.
Now, a number of questions come to mind. Maybe talk about how you see the court doing that. I take it from the chapter, it's judicial reflection on natural rights, judicially informed reasoning from natural rights that will give them the authority to overturn federal acts that are believed to be obstructing those rights. So I guess my question is, how is this going to work in practice?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that the founders who wrote the Ninth Amendment, in which they referred to unenumerated rights, did not scatter language carelessly in that document. They were careful about what they said. I'll give you two ways to start. I have a young son who is 27, just graduated from law school 2 years ago, and I told him, I said, your role in life is to relitigate the slaughterhouse cases and overturn the rational basis test. So, having the usual effect I have on my children, he went off to Hong Kong as a corporate lawyer. That's another matter. I would first say overturn the rational basis test, which simply says that when Congress intervenes in the economic liberties of Americans, if it can articulate any reason for doing so, and even if it doesn't articulate it, if the court can imagine it articulating a reason, then the court should defer. With regard to the slaughterhouse cases, it seems to me time to revisit what the 14th Amendment was trying to achieve with the language privileges or immunities of American citizens. I think the 14th Amendment tried to set out a national array of rights of citizens, which has to be thought of in terms of the 19th Amendment's affirmation of unenumerated rights. And you ask for how we start, that's how.
One question. So your constitutional text, say for economic liberties, would be the Ninth Amendment? That these are rights. These are rights. Okay.
That would certainly be part of it. Sure. I mean, the idea that you can have that citizens in an open, free society can flourish without the right to earn a living and to the right to keep a fair measure of the yields of their labor. I can't think of a more fundamental right. Essentially, the Civil War was fought over that because slavery was the complete annihilation of that right.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, as I think about the Ninth Amendment, and you note this in the book, it was a prudential measure indicating that over this question of the Bill of Rights, if we enumerate rights, does that mean rights not enumerated have been forfeit? And it was a way of saying to individuals in the states, no, that's not the case. But as I think about that, it's one question is, how should those be enforced, and what's the practical limit on them? Judicial counsel Alan Gura in the McDonald versus City of Chicago case over the Second Amendment tried to advance that reasoning you're suggesting, maybe not the same way you're suggesting, and crucially in front of the court was not able to answer, okay, so what's the limit? What are they? Why wouldn't it include, skateboarding down the street or something like that? And
a number of my conservative friends criticized what I said because they said, look, you're going to set out this buffet of rights and emancipate judges to go up and down with their trays, picking the ones they like and rejecting ones they didn't. To which I say that's a real danger. There's no question about it. But there is no safety in politics. There's no solution to this problem without danger. We now are living with the visible dangers of not enforcing certain fundamental rights. Is it a danger? Certainly. I accept entirely that criticism of me from a number of my good friends in the conservative movement. I just turn to them and say, well, you're looking for safety in a world that simply does not give safety, and I'm saying that an engaged judiciary is the least dangerous of the alternatives.
Yeah. I mean, one question. I know you've given a lot of attribution to my friend in Law and Liberty, a frequent contributor, Greg Weiner. He has a new book coming out on judicial review with Kansas Press this fall. Something he says frequently, and he says in the book, if we empower the judges, then who polices them? And that's a question also applicable because they're the last in time. It's hard to overturn or to undermine a Supreme Court precedent, as we observe with a lot of these social opinions in the Warren and Burger courts. And I think that's my basic concern here. And then also that they're reasoning from something as difficult to demarcate as natural rights. My wonder, and then also just think about 1937, you note that in the book as a crucial turning point. And in fact, it was interesting. I was at a conference in Europe, and an Irish academic said, there's not much history to our Constitution. It only started in 1937, to which I said, so did ours. And I was thinking about, but the deal that was largely struck was the American people wanted New Deal programs, which were seen as unconstitutional by classical liberals at the time. And the court recognized that it had to step back. It could not alone hold back the tide, which leads me to think, and you think about this, there's this famous debate in the 80s between then, I think, Professor Scalia and Professor Richard Epstein on this question of economic liberties. And Scalia says, I'm for them, but I think it's got to come through the legislature to be durable and to maintain itself. I come down on that side. I don't oppose these as a matter of policy, but I think it's, we've seen this with licensing regimes, state legislatures, Arizona, I think Idaho recently, overturning those. Yeah. That seems to me a much more efficient way to this route and durable route than, say, as much as I applaud them, the Institute for Justice litigating one case at a time.
Efficient maybe, but not necessarily durable. Your criticism I fully understand. You are, in a way, echoing Learned Hand's famous statement in his Godkin lectures I had the privilege of giving about 30 years after he did, in which he said it would be irksome to be ruled by a bevy of Platonic guardians, and that the court shouldn't be Platonic guardians, because that raises the question, among other things, of who will guard the guardians, who will look upon them and censor their behavior. I understand all that. I just think that the idea that majoritarian institutions, having lost all sense that ours is a government of limited, delegated, and enumerated powers, can any longer be trusted to be the judge of its own domain. That's where we need a more engaged judiciary.
Something that we'll move on. I'll leave with a question that I had, a decision that's roiled our politics for 50 years, continues to do so every day, but I didn't see you even mention it or discuss it, and that's Roe versus Wade, which would be, many would say, an instance of natural rights judiciary. And yet, I think you have to discuss it, but you don't. So I'll let you chime in on that.
Well, you're quite right. Roe v. Wade, which discovered a privacy right loitering in the emanations of penumbras, et cetera, is an example of what can go badly wrong when the judges try to settle a deeply divisive issue with judicial fiat. It's really the second great time in our history that this was attempted. The first was Dred Scott, where Justice Taney said, well, I'm going to settle this slavery argument, and then we'll move merrily on. We moved merrily on to Chickamauga and the wilderness and Gettysburg, etc. It's a danger. I can't say more than that. But the idea that there's a non-dangerous solution to the problem of government completely abandoning the idea of delegated and enumerated powers is itself a chimera.
No, that point's well taken. Think about the chapter, a very rich chapter, Culture and Opportunity. You make an observation, one that I've thought of, but you said it very clearly. American prosperity in the 20th century has done many things that are good, but one thing it's also done, which is paradoxical, is it's underwritten American dependency. I think that's worth reflecting on.
Well, there's no question that this is one of what we'd call the cultural contradictions of capitalism, to borrow Daniel Bell's phrase. When he used it 50 years ago, he said capitalism generates wealth, wealth generates luxury, luxury generates indolence and self-indulgence, and undermines the thrift and deferral of gratification on which capitalism depends. So capitalism is, by its very success, undermines its prerequisites. Another thing it does that Bell did not so much talk about was it generates enough social surplus that government can distribute this surplus through entitlement programs, which have the effect, and sometimes the intended effect, to destigmatize dependency and make people comfortable with their condition as wards of the state.
You were thinking about Daniel Patrick Moynihan, your friend. You give him a lot of observations and praise in the book. Moynihan, stepped forward and articulated, controversially received at the time, the Negro Family Report, 1965, noting, I think, out of marriage birth rates at like 35% in cause for concern.
23.7%.
Sorry, but he also noted this was happening in other Western European democracies as well. Those numbers are now considerably advanced for not only for the Black family, white family, Hispanics. It's have grown dramatically. In thinking about this underwriting of American dependency. But then there's also something else you talk about in the chapter, which I think is so much at the center of what's happened to the country and to our politics and the rise of Donald Trump, which is the retreat of men from work. We're told by, say, Trumpian figures that this is because there is no work for men, or men's wages have fallen owing to free trade, things like this, a lot of immigration. And even now, women don't want to marry them, and so this is also figuring into lower marriage rates and lower birth rates. I think you make a very convincing case that this is really not the case. It's much more about a choice to not work. 30% of American men of working age are not gainfully employed right now.
If we had the same workforce participation rate that we had 40 years ago, the unemployment rate would be very much higher than it is, because when people are not seeking jobs, they're not counted as unemployed. There is no question that if you want to flinch from saying that the new entitlements, particularly the Social Security, disability payments, and all the rest, have caused this flight of men of working age from the workforce, it certainly has enabled it. And that becomes a distinction without a difference. There is no question that it is now possible, because of government programs, to make the choice to abscond from the workforce and stay out of the workforce indefinitely.
And you also note it seems to coincide with the retreat from marriage as a whole.
Indeed. Indeed. It's part of it. I would even make it part of a yet larger phenomenon, the kind of infantilization of people that results from this web of supports from a well-intentioned but ultimately destructive state.
Then something you pick up on Nick Eberstadt's observation of the disability rules, and the two most cited reasons for going on disability now are musculoskeletal pain, which is basically back pain, and some sort of basically depression or sadness, which maybe is true in some sense of how one would experience yourself, how many do experience themselves, but doesn't really justify this reality and this use of the disability payment program.
Quite right. Yeah. Quite right.
So culture and opportunity. We've also got something else. We've got a lot of younger people interested. I keep reading about in socialism, interested in a vast government transfer payment system supporting these things, who have also taken on a lot of student debt because we've told them to. We've told them that's the path to the middle class or the upper middle class. So we've got, I guess my point is, we seem to have a lot of headwinds in trying to revive a culture of opportunity. How do you see those attempts going forward to revive work, or do we need to revive work? It's just sort of, it is there, but we've got on top of it, we've just got now this vast welfare state.
If we don't revive work as a reliable path to upward mobility, then we are stuck with the fact that we will be able to predict far too much of a young person's future by knowing about the young person's family. Families are the great transmitters of social capital, the habits, mores, customs, dispositions that enable one to take advantage of the opportunities of a free society. And today, it is far too possible to predict the trajectory of a young person's life by knowing about the lives of his parents. Parents have become very good, and I don't think this is a bad thing, but they become very good at passing on family advantages, with the result that the viscosity of society makes it difficult for upward mobility of a sort that Americans have been used to and have been used to thinking of as integral to American life.
Okay.
The problem is that as we become more and more a society more and more cognitively stratified, that is rewarding primarily those Americans who are gifted with the manipulation of ideas and data. It turns out that even universal free public education, even if it was done well, which it rarely is, but even done well, universal free public education cannot come close to equalizing the ability of individuals to add value to society. So as we become a more cognitive, intense economy, stratification is going to get worse. And I don't know what to do about that, and no one else does, as far as I can tell.
No, and I think this is where we emphasize, it seems to me, this part of man, part of human nature that we also have to support, I think, in our laws and our culture is the relational part of man and a man's need in family and community to be supported. And it seems so many of the economic causes that I keep hearing are actually very deeply cultural causes and things that economics can do very little. But if we do get the cultural supports right, that the market actually needs them, even though the market, I think, can't generate them on its own or replace them. This is another part of what it means to be a human person. And that seems to have fallen off as we began this particular part of the discussion with the fall off in marriage and birth rates outside of marriage, which, if you think if you grow up in a one-parent household, and not to denigrate those, but just there are challenges there that are unavoidable for many. And then you pluck on, add on bad education. You add on sort of how is one motivated to succeed, and things are just going to be difficult for you. And
let me just give you just a few numbers. When Pat Moynihan, as a 38-year-old social scientist in Lyndon Johnson's Labor Department, issued his report saying there was a crisis in the African-American family because 23.7% of babies were born out of wedlock. Today it's 72%. 40% of all first births in America, regardless of race, color, creed, or national origin, 40% of first births are out of wedlock. And a majority of mothers under 30 are not living with the fathers of their children. When Moynihan issued his report, he said the following. He said, the lesson of history is clear. From the wild Irish slums of the East Coast in the 19th century to South Central Los Angeles today, when you have a large cohort of adolescent males without fathers in the home, you have chaos. Yeah. I've raised 3 boys, and I know that the whole point of civilization is to civilize adolescent males. And we now have ample proof of what happens when you don't have fathers helping with that task.
Yeah, no, I'm learning with my own 3 boys how hard that task is. So no,
exactly.
I understand.
There's nothing like that experience.
From 4, I've got them from age 4 to age 15. Thinking about, so we'll move forward here. I know our time is running short. Conservatism without theism, and I want to let you talk about that. And you also you pick on 2 thinkers who have been instrumental, one of whom I wrote a book on, Whittaker Chambers, but you also criticized Russell Kirk in this regard. So maybe tell us why conservatism can thrive better without theism.
I think Bill Buckley put it well long ago. He said a conservative need not be religious, but he cannot despise religions. And I think that's right on both counts. The durable world religions are responses to timeless human yearnings and aspirations and injunctions. And they're not to be despised. I'm not convinced. Someone once said to Bertrand Russell, who was an atheist, he said, when you come before a God after you die, and he says, why didn't you believe? What are you going to say? And Russell's going to say, you didn't provide enough evidence. And that's sort of my position. I describe myself as an amiable, low-voltage atheist, but it is simply wrong and annoying and politically destructive for people such as Whittaker Chambers and Russell Kirk to say that in order to be a conservative, you have to have a religious faith. There are now more atheists in America than there are mainline Protestants. This is a growing, rapidly growing cohort.
We're mainline Protestants. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No. I just want to, sort of a foundational question that I think about a lot, maybe a metaphysical question, and I think you quote Whittaker Chambers as saying, "Man without mysticism is a monster." And as I was thinking about that quote, and I think, what did he mean by being a mystic? And he reports several instances of that in Witness, one of which sounds strange, I think, to people, is he thought he heard the audible voice of God tell him to fight for freedom. He also talks about a mystical experience he has as a young boy. He grew up on Long Island in the very early 20th century, before it was even developed, really. And he talks about walking through a field of flowers, and he heard a bird, and he had this sort of hushed sense of majesty and awe, and he talks about that being a mystical experience. And he also talks about, famously, every communist hears the screams of those who its system tortures. But what he means by that is, if you hear the screams, you hear the soul, and that's what communism, atheistic materialism denies. It denies the soul, and so you brush up against the soul. Chambers says, and I think this is, I would argue for this metaphysically, but also as a Christian, I think if you brush up against the soul, the question is, what's the ground of the soul? And Chambers says it's God. And I would argue freedom is a gift, and the ground of freedom, I don't think, could just be materialism or sort of an evolutionary sociobiology. I think if you move in that direction, you're more in Larry Arnhart's direction of sort of amiable chimps or Aristotelian socialized beings.
Yes. There's another famous passage in Whittaker Chambers' Witness that Ronald Reagan was terribly fond of, and that is when Chambers looks at his daughter's ear, and he's just struck by the wonderful complexity of human beings. And I fully understand that response. It's a civilized, humane response. I just don't think that marveling at this complexity entails, logically or otherwise, postulating a creator.
Yeah. I wonder, I do think, too, the ground of natural rights, I was thinking about your book and the overall, one of your large claims, seems to be the way back to natural rights, really, for many Americans, would actually be a recovery, I think, of the traditional metaphysical categories that Chambers was trying to elucidate, as he thought, in a modern age that was devoid of any religion, was increasingly devoid of religious faith. So, that's another question I have, is how do we get Americans back to believing in natural rights? And I'm skeptical it's going to come through a rational way. You suggest maybe another way is the majesty of history, the majesty of the American founding in your last chapter, which I loved reading, and I love the title of it, Borne Back.
Well, all I can say is you can curse the darkness or light a candle.
Yeah.
And my book is my candle. It's a 600-page candle, and I'd like to think it's the most important development in publishing since Gutenberg invented movable type. I know better, but I do think that American conservatism, from the beginning of its post-war revival, that in a way began with Professor Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences. American conservatism has been a very bookish persuasion. And I think I believe in books, I believe in arguments, I believe in the printed word, and I think I do not believe in inevitabilities. So I think we've made some wrong turnings, and we can backtrack and start afresh.
Thinking, and you suggest in this title, Towards a Usable Past, which I love, in that in the end you quote from The Great Gatsby, in this idea of rowing against the current, rowing back towards our founding, towards our origins.
Yes.
Yeah. No, George Will, thank you so much. Now, the book would be definitely will be, I think, a major imprint, dent in the mind of American conservatism. Congratulations on the achievement, and I hope you sell a lot of copies. And thank you for talking to us today.
I enjoyed it very much. Thanks for having me.
This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.